All right, let's get started. Thanks for coming, guys. It's Monday, February 3rd. It's our first Energy Law Lecture Series event for the semester. You guys who attended last fall know how this drill works. We'll have 3 of these during the spring semester. This is our first one, and I'll introduce our guest speaker today in a minute. But let me tell you about the next event, so you can go ahead and make a note, those of you who are here in the auditorium, as well as those of you who are joining us remotely via Zoom. And that next event will be on Monday, March 24th. So for us, that's after spring break. This is the Monday after we come back from spring break that previous week. Monday, March 24th at noon in Lanier, and our guest speaker will be Tricia Curtis. Tricia is president and CEO of an organization called Petro Nerds, based out of Denver, and she's really sharp. She's got a great website, great podcast, really entertaining, interesting person on energy policy, and she'll be our next guest speaker in the lecture series. Again, that'll be Monday, March 24th. I also want to alert those of you who are joining us via Zoom that not only are our Energy Law Lecture Series events approved for 1-hour CLE for attorneys here in Texas, but these events now are also approved for continuing education credit for landmen for AAPL and for folks who are members of the National Association of Royalty Owners, NARO, as well as those of you who are lease and title analysts and members of NALTA. So these other organizations are now approving and accrediting these lecture events for their continuing education, as well as like we've always had for lawyers and the State Bar of Texas. Okay, so those of you who are going to want that State Bar of Texas credit, just stay tuned. At the end of the lecture, Blake Groves will put the QR code up on the screen, and you can do that thing with your phone to get the QR code, and it will automatically register you for credit. And if you need the course number after the lecture because you couldn't get your phone to work or whatever, just let me or Blake know, and we'll get you the course number information as well. So our guest speaker today is Bernard Weinstein, and Bud's a longtime friend and frankly is the guy who holds the record now, since we've been doing these Energy Law Lecture events starting in 2014, as the lecturer with the highest number of guest appearances. This will be number 3 for him. So he's been here twice before, seasoned veteran, and for good reason. He's really great, and he's just an encyclopedia of knowledge, and it's always fun to have him. And so we're awfully pleased that he could join us again today. He's a distinguished energy economist and an emeritus professor at SMU. He brings decades of expertise in energy security, economic development, and public policy. He was associate director of the Maguire Energy Institute, an adjunct professor of business economics at SMU's Cox School of Business. He has served as director of the Center for Economic Development and Research at the University of North Texas, contributed to federal agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, the Federal Trade Commission. He's consulted for companies like AT&T, Texas Instruments, Reliant, Devon Energy. His testimony and insights have informed legislative, regulatory, and judicial bodies across the nation. He's an accomplished author and researcher. He's contributed to professional journals such as Land Economics, Economic Development Quarterly, and Policy Studies Journal. His op-eds have appeared in major publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. It's just a lot of fun to have him back for his 3rd visit in this lecture series. Please help me welcome Dr. Bernard Weinstein.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Bill. I retired 4 years ago. I think Bill invited me back just to see if there was anything left in my head that I could convey to the law students. And before I get started, a disclaimer. I prepared this presentation before President Trump issued his declaration of energy dominance a week and a half ago. So I'll comment on that towards the end of the talk, but the ideas in here are mine, and they're not President Trump's. So we'll see. Bill mentioned that this is my third visit. I spoke to this group on February 13th, 2017. And do you know what the title was? Donald Trump's path to the presidency. Will it be good for Texas and our energy industry? That was 8 years ago, almost to the day that I was speaking here. And I won't answer that question just yet. Because with everything in Trump world, it's too early to tell what the results will be of Trump's energy dominance agenda, or for that matter, any other aspects of his policy agenda, which seems to change every day. Now, let's see. How do I make this go forward? Okay. So I'm going to talk about the energy transition. And what I mean by the energy transition is greater use of electricity. That's really what it's about. Energy has been transitioning itself since the caveman discovered fire. But in contemporary terms, when we talk about the energy transition, as we have for the past 5 or 6 years, it's really about using more electricity to power the American economy, or for that matter, to power the global economy. And in order to do that, presumably, we want to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and replace them with clean energy. And I put clean in parentheses because there's a lot of debate about how clean some of these sources are. But for our purposes, we'll use the term clean to refer to wind, solar, batteries, hydro, geothermal, and maybe nuclear. So again, and this is kind of pre-Trump 2.0 thinking, the energy transition, number one, shift power generation away from fossil fuels. Number two, shift the transportation sector away from fossil fuels. So, here we go. It's all about electricity, as I said, because if you think about it, you can really break the world into the electricity haves and the electricity have-nots. If you have abundant supplies of electricity and affordable supplies of electricity, you're in the developed world, the high-watt world. If you don't have a lot of electricity, your economy is not going to be nearly well as developed. And there are some parts of the world where communities virtually have no access to electricity. But I would argue that the energy future, both in the United States and around the world, is electricity. But of course, it takes power to make power, and that's what we'll be talking about. Electricity consumption in the United States, it's kind of interesting. It was pretty flat for 15 years. I mean, I can remember some pundits saying, we have reached peak power demand. We've become so efficient in our use of electricity that we'll never need to build any new power plants. And then a couple of years ago, power demand, after a long hiatus, started to pick up. So the NERC, which stands for the National Electric Reliability Council, they are looking ahead 8 years, and they see a fairly significant increase in power demand. That's about a 15% jump just in 8 years. And that's a lot of juice. Here's another way to look at it. You can see to the left part of the screen kind of historic growth in U.S. power demand, and then that flat period that I was talking about. And then 3 years ago, the demand for power starts to grow again. Now, why is this happening? There are lots of reasons the demand for electricity is growing. One, it's the general expansion of the U.S. economy. Our economy has been growing faster than those of most other countries. We've seen somewhat of a revival in the manufacturing sector as a result of reshoring. Crypto mining uses a lot of electrons. Electric vehicle growth may or may not continue, but that's been another source of demand for electricity. And then more recently, data centers and artificial intelligence. And I'm sure you've been reading about that. Data centers and AI, they use billions and billions of megawatts in order to operate. Heat pumps, substituting heat pumps for furnaces in homes and in offices. Green hydrogen, don't have really time to get into that, but some believe that hydrogen will be a major fuel in the future. Green hydrogen means using electricity to separate the hydrogen atoms from the oxygen atoms, and it's very energy intensive. Texas ranks number 2 in terms of the growth of electric power demand for commercial purposes, right behind Virginia. And a lot of that is due to the growth of server farms and artificial intelligence. Northern Virginia is a major locus for those types of facilities. The Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Austin, San Antonio area, also getting a lot of investment in server farms and AI projects and crypto mining. Electric vehicle sales, both pure electric and hybrid, they have been rising steadily for the past decade. President Trump wants to get rid of the tax breaks for electric vehicles. If that happens, will the demand for EVs continue to grow? And again, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. We'll just have to wait and see how that plays out. But that has been one of the sources of demand growth. Here's the AI boom in context. 2026 versus 2022, you can see there's been a tremendous amount of growth. The Energy Information Administration has actually projected that by the year 2030, which is only 5 years from now, something like 17% of the electricity produced in the United States could be allocated or consumed by data centers and artificial intelligence. And, there are different scenarios proposed here, but I don't think this new Chinese app, AI app, this DeepSeek thing is really going to derail these projections of power demand. It does appear that DeepSeek operates with a lot less power consumption than other AI technologies, but we'll just have to wait and see. I don't believe any company like NVIDIA or Microsoft is planning to change their forecast for power demand. These are the hottest server farm markets. I mentioned that before. Northern Virginia is number 1. Dallas-Fort Worth is number 2. So it's big business, and it's a lot of money. Well, as I said at the outset, it takes power to make power. You just don't flip on a switch and get electricity going through these light bulbs. So if we look at the generation mix over the last 20 years, you can see there's been a noticeable change. The biggest change is the decline in coal. Coal's contribution to electric power generation in the United States has dropped dramatically, and it has been replaced by rising natural gas use and by renewables, which is that bottom line. So now renewables are pumping more electrons into the grid. Well, I'm talking about installed capacity. Renewables aren't always on. But in terms of installed capacity, we have more invested in renewables than we have in coal and in nuclear. So natural gas and renewables are up. Coal is way down, and nuclear is kind of holding its own. Nuclear still about 18 to 20% of the power generation mix in the United States. Renewable investment has really been where the money has gone in terms of power generation over the past decade. This is through 2023, and huge investments in renewables. Very little investment in traditional power generation like coal, gas, or nuclear. In fact, last year, 96% of all new U.S. power plants were carbon-free. You can see solar, batteries, wind, some gas, and nuclear is up a little bit. But I don't know, maybe that's the plant that just came online at the end of the year in South Carolina or Georgia, one of those states. It taken 20 years to complete and 5 or 6 times over budget. Energy generated by solar and wind. Did you know that Texas is #1 now in both wind and solar? We now have something like 18 gigawatts of installed solar. There was a big piece in the Dallas News yesterday. I don't know if you read it. It's really worth a look, though, about these planned solar farms in East Texas and some of the pushback they're getting from farmers and ranchers and others who fear losing yet more land to solar farms. They've lost a lot of land over the decades to reservoirs, and now they see the big threat in terms of their lifestyle, their quality of life as being proposed new solar farms. So if we look at renewables in the pipeline here in Texas, you can see solar has really been the big kahuna over the past year. And I forget how much is slated to come online in 2025. Now, again, President Trump has said he wants to do away with subsidies to renewable energy. That's not going to be easy for a number of reasons, particularly because a lot of these investments in wind and solar are in Republican-dominated states and who kind of like those subsidies. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens on that front. Battery storage. California leads in battery storage, but Texas is not far behind, and battery storage is important, obviously. If you're going to rely more and more on renewable energy, which is intermittent, you've got to have backup. So backup has to be either a thermal plant like natural gas or coal, or batteries. Batteries are expensive, industrial scale batteries. There are battery farms in the Austin area that have been built by Elon Musk. There's a couple out in California. But in terms of the amount of power they can provide to the grid, say in an emergency, it's very, very limited. So will we continue to invest in batteries if the incentives aren't there? I don't know. Again, we just have to wait and see. But you can't be heavily reliable on renewables unless you have backup power, because power system has to be reliable, and you can't rely just on intermittent sources like wind and solar. Now, as we saw earlier, coal use has been dropping pretty dramatically. We've got more coal than any other country in the world, but we don't produce much. We still export some coal. We're not using much for power generation. We export mainly metallurgical coal, and most of that goes to Europe, which is different than thermal coal. Here's another way to look at the declining role of coal in the power mix. You can see year by year, going back to 2014, it's been dropping. So there are more, or should I say more than 1,000 coal plants have been shuttered in the United States over the last 25 years. Think about that. 1,000 coal plants have been closed. Last year alone, we shuttered 22.3 gigawatts. Excuse me, not last year. That was between 2021 and 2023. So here's a map that shows some of those plants that have been shut down. And while we've been closing coal plants and investing heavily in renewables, Investment in conventional gas plants in particular has slowed markedly. You can see there was a big jump in the middle of the 2000s, but the last couple of years, actually for the last 15 years, there hasn't been much investment in new large-scale gas-fired power generation boilers. And here's another concern. Now, this may be moot now because Trump says he wants to do away with these new EPA rules. But last year, the EPA enacted rules with very, very high requirements for carbon capture that, frankly, are both economically and technically non-attainable. And I think they were intentionally designed that way to hasten the closure not only of coal plants, but of some gas plants. This is actually an article that I wrote about that. You can click onto it and read it. But Trump says he wants to do away with these new EPA rules. He wants to deregulate the power sector, including repealing what he sees as very onerous EPA requirements for carbon capture. Another problem with wind is that the wind isn't always blowing. This is one of Robert Bryce's charts. He says, last year, the average utilization rate of the wind turbine fleet fell to an 8-year low of 33.5%. So again, this kind of makes the case. Yeah, we've been investing like crazy in wind and in solar, but when the wind's not blowing, guess what? You don't get any electrons. A lot of hype about offshore wind. Bryce has concluded that offshore wind was never going to make much of a contribution to U.S. power generating capacity. And in fact, a number of big projects have been canceled on the East Coast just in the last few months. I mean, this is very, very expensive level of investment for a relatively little output. So a couple of these mega projects have been put on ice, and I don't think they're going to come back. I was talking about how some of the folks in East Texas aren't happy about all these new solar farms. Lots of people around the country don't like solar farms. They don't like wind farms if they have to hear them, if they have to look at them. So, some communities are actually refusing to allow the construction of renewable facilities in their backyard. And this, again, compilation that Robert Bryce did on the number of wind and solar rejections between 2015 and 2023. Now, there's a related issue that is really critical, and that is the integrity of the nation's transmission grids. And here we have some serious challenges. We've had serious challenges here in Texas. I'm sure you remember the deep freeze 4 years ago, and efforts that have been made since then to upgrade the transmission grid. It's just not, ERCOT is kind of an island. ERCOT is down here at the bottom. That's the Texas power grid. We have limited interconnects with the rest of the country. But the rest of the country has, there are two major grids, and then there are these, what you might call subgrids or system regional transmission operators. I won't get into all the jargon, but we have been underinvesting in America's power grids for a long, long time. And if we're going to use more electricity to run the economy, we're going to need to upgrade the transmission system. But the question is, who's going to pay for it? The International Energy Agency says that grid investments need to double to meet climate targets. Well, we don't have climate targets anymore, supposedly. But in any case, we're going to need a tremendous amount of new investment in the power grid in order, it's not just to meet climate targets, it's in order to meet projected demand. And other evidence of problems with the grid, these were major disturbances on the grid between 20 and 2023. And there's been a huge increase in the number of disturbances. When we say major disturbances, we're really talking about major blackouts or major brownouts or some other natural disaster that has taken down the power grid in some parts of the country. And we've certainly seen that quite a bit in Texas. And the fact is that we haven't been investing in transmission. And there are lots of reasons for that. But if you ask me, what should be on the agenda of the Trump administration in terms of energy policy, maintaining or providing incentives to upgrade the power grid, I think it would rank number one. So here's the problem. So I talked about the supply side. Well, first we talked about the demand side, where the increase in demand for electricity is coming from. And then we talked about the supply side. Well, on the right here, we have demand accelerating as we use more electricity, as data centers and artificial intelligence grow, as we use more commercial and industrial purposes, electric vehicles. And then if we look at the supply side, we have transmission issues, we've had underinvestment in infrastructure, and increasing reliance on intermittent energy sources. So that is the basic imbalance between, or should I say, the potential imbalance between the demand and supply of electrons. As we've been replacing baseload power, that's 24/7 power, that's what you get from a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a large gas plant, replacing it with renewable intermittent generation. And until that time, which may be 100 years from now, that we have lots and lots of battery storage, this is thin ice to be skating on. A couple of inconvenient truths. Most climate policies don't work. And this isn't my conclusion. This was a study that was done by an evaluation of 1,500 climate policies in 41 countries. That only 63 actually work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Anyhow, I just threw this in. The electric vehicle transition, that isn't. Ford losses keep rising as the EV share of auto sales declines. Inconvenient truth number two. How much electricity would it actually take to power all cars if they were electric? We would have to increase domestic power supply by 20 to 50% if we wanted to shift all vehicles from internal combustion to electricity. Boy, that's a lot of power. It's not clear, where those electrons would come from. Inconvenient truth number three. Whatever environmentalists like to believe, the reality is that oil and gas are going to remain the top energy sources, both in the U.S. and around the world, for the foreseeable future. According to Exxon, the foreseeable future is 2050, and this is from their latest annual report, but it's been backed up by the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the International Energy Agency. They all agree that 25 years from now, oil, natural gas will continue to be the primary energy sources both here and around the world. In other words, fossil fuels aren't going away anytime soon. So this is a projection from the Energy Information Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce, looking out to the year 2050, and you can see natural gas remains king. We do see a flattening of oil production, renewables continue to grow, nuclear stays flat, coal continues to decline. So this is the energy future as seen by the U.S. government's primary statistical agency, the font of knowledge when it comes to the energy outlook. So what policy changes are required if we're going to ensure that we have enough affordable electrons to meet future demand and to keep baseload in the mix? Well, again, I came up with this list before Mr. Trump's energy dominance declaration. And these are the four things I think are most important. Number one, remove or reduce the egregious subsidies for wind and solar. Now, I've been preaching that a long time, and my environmental friends, they always push back at me and say, well, look at all the subsidies that oil and gas get. And I just don't go into it because it's not, that's apples and oranges. But it's interesting. Do you know that we have been subsidizing wind and solar for 50 years at the federal level? And we also had lots of states provide additional subsidies to wind and solar. So I think if we can get rid of these subsidies, that will put all generation on a more level playing field. And that would help encourage investment in baseload power. I do think those EPA regulations that Trump wants to get rid of for coal and gas need to be modified. I don't know that I would scrap them entirely. I do think it's important to have some climate policies and to be concerned about carbon capture. But clearly those regs should be modified because right now they're unattainable. I mean, it's just natural gas and coal plants. There's no way they can comply without shutting down. On number three, I'm a big fan of nuclear. Trump has been pretty silent on nuclear, but we did have something that passed last year called the it didn't pass, it was introduced. It was actually bipartisan legislation called the Energy Permitting Reform Act that would make it easier to apply for nuclear permits and also secure some funding and expand some of the low interest loans that are available for nuclear energy. As I said, Trump really hadn't said anything about nuclear, but that would be on my list of things to do. I think nuclear has to be part of the future. And then I'm really concerned about number four, because Trump wants to kill several programs that are actually helping investor-owned utilities upgrade their transmission infrastructure. The infrastructure bill, the inflation, the IRA, the Inflation Recovery Act, I think that's what it stands for. Trump wants to kill those. And that's where most of the federal funding to help upgrade the nation's transmission infrastructure is coming from. So, Mr. Trump, if you're watching on Zoom, please take heed. Now, it's not as bleak as I'm painting it out to be. Markets have an interesting way of responding to economic reality. And in fact, we are starting to see a pickup in investment in natural gas power plants. You can see there's an uptick projected for 2025 and significant new plants projected to come online over the next 5 years. So that's a good news story. Natural gas is coming back, and I think a lot of it is being driven by this AI boom, as it's sometimes called, artificial intelligence, server farms, all that require tremendous amounts of electricity. So I see that as a positive that's helping to stimulate new investment in baseload power generation. You may know that Texas leads the nation in new gas-fired generation capacity. And part of this is a result of the deep freeze 4 years ago. We have a state program, I forget what it's called, but it does provide incentives to companies to build gas plants. And we are building gas plants all across the state. And that's going to be good for the state's economy. It's going to be good for our continued ability to attract industry, not just AI and server farms and Teslas, but manufacturing in general, which uses a lot of electricity. And we're going to have reliable 24/7 power in addition to all this renewable energy that we have. Nationwide, there's also evidence that some gas plants that were scheduled for closure, the closure is being delayed, that these plants are being kept open, again, in the face of growing demand for power. So again, another piece of good news on the supply side. Now, these plants, these are fossil fuel plants across the U.S., and some of them that were slated for closure are actually being extended. And what we also see here, and I know it's hard with all the different colors on there, it gives you a sense of where the new investment is occurring in natural gas plants. And we're also, I think, getting more serious about keeping nuclear in the mix. We've closed about 20 nuclear plants over the last 15 years, but some plants that were scheduled for closure are having their licenses extended. You may have read about Microsoft's plan to restart 3 Mile Island, which is one of the plants in Pennsylvania that was shuttered after an accident in 1979. Constellation Energy has apparently entered into a deal with Microsoft to reopen that plant. Now, it's going to take a long time. It's going to be expensive, but Microsoft's got the cash, and apparently they're going to buy the power if and when that nuclear plant is up and running again. And then we're seeing a lot of research with small modular reactors. I understand you had a speaker here recently who was talking about molten salt as a potential way to generate nuclear energy. So nuclear has got to be part of the future, and I think it is going to come back. So, and we're also starting to see more investment in energy grid infrastructure, both in the United States and around the world. Indeed, that's forecast to increase significantly over the next 5 years, according to the International Energy Agency. What does this all mean for Texas oil and gas industry? Well, I think it's all good news. Last year was a record-breaking year for oil and gas production in the state of Texas. You're probably aware of that. Here's a chart that shows what's been happening. Going back to 2019, and Texas is in red, all other states are in black. So we're doing great. Energy Information Administration projects rising U.S. natural gas prices, particularly as a result of growing LNG demand. We're now the #1 exporter of liquefied natural gas. A decade ago, we weren't exporting any liquefied natural gas. We were importing it. Now we're #1 in the world in terms of liquefied natural gas exports. The oil and gas industry has been great for Texas state and local budgets, generates all kinds of revenue at the state level and at the local level. It's helping to fund, well, for decades, it's helped to fund higher education in Texas. Last year, oil and gas industry generated $27 billion worth of taxes and revenues for the state. And if you look at the last 15 years, something like $257 billion of revenues have accrued to the state from oil and gas operations. So let me let's talk for a minute about President Trump's energy emergency, as he calls it. So President Trump declared an energy emergency 2 weeks ago, or a week and a half ago. I don't know. How long has he been in the White House this time? I guess it's only been 2 weeks. Anyhow, so he says, we have an energy emergency. And I was not aware of it. I don't think anybody really thought there was an energy emergency, but President Trump says there is. And I guess by declaring a national emergency, that gives the executive, more power to do things that he couldn't do if it weren't an emergency. So I'm not going to read all this, but this is the kind of the outlines of what President Trump says he wants to do under the rubric of a national energy emergency. And my question is, what does this mean for the power grid? Is anything here going to help the power grid? Well, I think some of the things will help on the generation side, particularly if he does away with some of the, if not all of the subsidies for wind and solar and puts all generation on a more level playing field. But as I said earlier, I think investment in the transmission grid is really paramount. And I don't see anything in here, nor have I heard anything coming from the Trump White House about initiatives that can upgrade the power grid. And if we had another hour, that's just what I talk about, because that's really, really critical. And here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that electricity is what makes the American economy competitive. And it makes us competitive because we can produce electricity 1/3 cheaper than other OECD countries. Now, maybe it's cheaper in Norway, I don't know, but we have cheap and abundant power, potential power, and that's really a critical aspect of America's competitive advantage, trade wars notwithstanding. I mean, if you think about it, if we really go into a full-blown trade war, then we're giving away our competitive advantage, which would really be stupid. So you may have seen that there was a truce declared on the tariff front today, at least a truce with Mexico for a month, and we'll see if there's some accommodation. So that's kind of my overview of what's happening in energy. Getting back to the main point, I think it's all about electricity and how we generate it and how we transmit it and how we use it. I think that's really the critical energy issue that we face, is how to ensure that we have enough electrons on the grids in the future to meet the growing demand for power. So we have a few minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Oh, way in the back. Oh, I see two hands.
How do you handle any pushback that you get from environmentalists concerning the importance of oil and gas?
I just try to dope them up with a dose of realism. I mean, look at the numbers. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Now, I haven't talked about climate change, and I haven't talked about greenhouse gas emissions. And, you know, I'm sensitive to that. I don't think we ought to, I think it's a mistake to pull out of the Paris Climate Treaty for a second time. I think we need a seat at the table. I think climate change is a serious issue. I think climate change is in part a result of human activity, and if there's things we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's good for the planet, we should do so. So, but I'm not, I guess what really annoys me is that when I come across radical, I call them radical environmentalists, who basically say, look, oil and gas are bad for the planet, end of story. We've got to shut down the pipelines. We got to close the refineries. We got to blow up the pipelines. You may remember a couple of years ago, that was a favorite sport of environmentalists, was trying to blow up pipelines. And there was actually a movie made about that. But I didn't know, gosh, I guess I don't know whether it's good or bad, but I haven't heard much from the environmental community over the last couple of months. Have you? I guess they're trying to figure out what to do next against this energy dominance agenda of President Trump, where he says that climate change is a hoax and we're going to pull out of the Paris Climate Treaty and renewables, this, renewables. I mean, anyhow. So that's how I deal with it. I just say, hey, look at the facts. Another factoid. If I could wave a magic wand and get every transportation vehicle in the world off of oil and forgetting about where the electrons would come from for the electric fleet that presumably would replace them. getting rid of oil in the transportation sector would only decrease demand worldwide by 50%. That's the other thing we don't remember is that petroleum and natural gas are used for lots of other things besides transportation and power generation, including this sport jacket, including most of the building materials in this lecture hall are petroleum derived. So, and I could go on, everything from basketballs to drugs. And I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of products that are derived from oil, natural gas, petrochemicals. And if you want those products, you've got to have oil, natural gas, and petrochemicals. So.
I was wondering the 3 Mile Island reopening. Do you
Yes.
think that'll happen a lot more with AI and data centers becoming more and more popular?
Well, supposedly that's why Microsoft is going to invest in reopening this plant. I mean, that's what they say. And again, I don't know what's involved in terms of, I mean, this thing is mothballed and it's been decommissioned and they've removed all the fuel rods. And I mean, I don't know what's involved. It may or may not happen, but what Microsoft says, hey, we see this as a reliable source of carbon-free electricity that we can use to power our data farms and our AI. And they might not use it directly, but if it goes into the grid, they can say, hey, we're contributing, we're a green company. Look, we're producing this power and we're selling it into the grid. So we'll see if that happens. And there are other things. I think finally nuclear is going to have a revival. But it would be nice if there were some federal push to it. There was a little bit during the Biden administration, but as I said, so far the Trump people have not really said anything about nuclear. Now, drill baby drill, it sounds great, but that ain't going to happen because drill baby drill is a function of price. At today's prices, nobody wants to go drill baby drill. And if you look 5 years into the future, nobody wants to drill baby drill if you believe these forecasts of global oil output. So, the new administration is, I think eventually they're going to, I think they know that drill baby drill is jargon and it's not going to happen because you guys know better than anyone that the economics of the oil patch have changed and it's all about the bottom line, not the number of drilling rigs and not raw production.
Thank Dr. Weinstein for being with us today. All right, for those of you on Zoom, just stay tuned for the QR code for CLE credit, and all of you, mark your calendars for Monday, March 24th for our next lecture event. Thanks for being here. Way to go. You got the ball. We actually offered electricity law. Yeah, I'm trying to make that a part of the recurring subject matter that we offer. Go down.